People like you should clean pianos, not touch them." The words cut clean through the grand ballroom of the Laurent Symphony Hall, sharp enough to silence even the soft clinking of crystal champagne glasses for half a second before laughter rolled across the room in polished waves. Some laughed politely. Others smirked behind raised wine glasses. A few investors exchanged amused glances beneath the golden chandeliers hanging 40 feet above the marble floor. Ethan Vale didn't respond. He stood quietly beside the 9-foot Steinway, one hand resting lightly against the black lacquer finish while the other held a folded tuning cloth worn soft with age. His gray maintenance jacket looked painfully ordinary against the sea of tailored tuxedos and designer gowns. The silver name badge on his chest reflected the ballroom lights in small dull flashes. Maintenance staff. Victoria Laurent stepped closer, elegant and commanding in a dark emerald evening gown that carried the effortless authority of old money and billion-dollar decisions. Her heels clicked slowly against the marble as she studied Ethan with the calm impatience of someone used to being obeyed instantly. "This piano costs more than most homes in Nebraska," she said coolly. "I'd rather not have fingerprints from someone uneducated all over it before tonight's gala." Another ripple of laughter spread through the hall. Ethan lowered his eyes briefly, not in shame, but in restraint. Near the back of the ballroom, 12-year-old Clara Vale froze beside the catering table, her small fingers tightening around a silver tray of untouched sparkling water. She had heard people mock her father before. Mechanics. Janitors. Single dads in worn jackets were easy targets in rooms built for power. But something about tonight felt crueler. Maybe it was the way the laughter echoed beneath the vaulted ceilings. Maybe it was the way her father simply accepted it without defending himself. Or maybe it was the piano standing between them like an old memory refusing to die. The hall itself glowed with impossible wealth. Gold-trimmed balconies curved above rows of wealthy donors and classical patrons. Soft amber light spilled across polished marble columns. Waiters moved silently between tables carrying lobster tails, filet mignon, and glasses of 20-year bourbon. At the center of it all sat the Steinway Grand, prepared for the evening's featured pianist, a world-famous performer flying in from Vienna for Victoria Laurent's annual charity concert. But backstage whispers had already started spreading through the ballroom like cold wind under a locked door. The pianist's private jet had been delayed by a severe storm over Chicago. 40 minutes late. Then 50. Then an hour. Victoria checked her diamond watch and exhaled sharply through her nose. Investors worth billions were seated in front of her. Media cameras waited near the stage. The silence was becoming expensive. Ethan quietly finished adjusting one of the piano legs and stepped back. Calm. Invisible. The way men like him learned to survive. Victoria glanced toward him again, irritation flickering behind her composed expression. "Unless," she said dryly, loud enough for nearby guests to hear, "our maintenance man here secretly graduated from Juilliard." The room erupted harder this time. Clara lowered her eyes. Ethan remained still. But across the ballroom, near the back row beneath the balcony shadows, an elderly man suddenly stood up so fast his bourbon glass slipped from his hand and shattered across the marble floor. His pale eyes locked onto Ethan's hands resting beside the piano. And for the first time that evening, someone in the hall forgot how to breathe. The sound of shattered glass echoed across the ballroom like a crack through ice on a frozen lake. Conversation stopped mid-sentence. A violinist near the stage lowered her instrument slowly. Even the waiters froze beside silver trays glowing beneath chandelier light. The elderly man standing near the back row stared at Ethan Vale with widening eyes that looked almost frightened by recognition. His breathing became shallow. One trembling hand gripped the edge of a white linen tablecloth as if steadying himself against a memory too large to carry all at once. "No," he whispered softly. "It cannot be." Victoria Laurent turned sharply, annoyance flickering across her face. "Professor Beaumont?" she asked. "Are you all right?" Arthur Beaumont barely heard her. At 78 years old, the retired chairman of the New York Conservatory had spent his entire life around greatness. He had heard prodigies in Vienna, masters in Paris, children capable of turning audiences silent with a single movement of their hands. But there was only one pianist he had ever described as unforgettable. And that young man had vanished nearly 15 years ago without explanation. Ethan calmly bent down beside the broken glass and helped a startled waiter gather the larger pieces into a cloth napkin. No embarrassment. No defensiveness. Just quiet. Patience. Professor Beaumont took 2 slow steps forward. "Your hands," he said carefully. Ethan paused. The room watched. "I never forget hands," the old professor continued, his voice softer now. "Especially hands that once made an entire concert hall in Prague stand and weep." A murmur spread across nearby tables. Victoria crossed her arms instinctively, uncertain whether the old man was confused or serious. Ethan finally looked up, and for a moment something passed across his face. Not fear. Not pride. Recognition. Then it disappeared just as quickly beneath the calm mask he wore so naturally. "You have mistaken me for someone else," Ethan said quietly. Professor Beaumont shook his head immediately. "No. I do not believe I have." Clara stared at her father from across the ballroom. Her chest tightened. She had seen strange things growing up. The old metronome hidden in the closet. Stacks of yellowed sheet music tucked into boxes marked winter clothes. Her father sitting alone some nights in silence with headphones on, eyes closed, one hand moving faintly through the air as if conducting invisible notes. But he never explained any of it. Never. Victoria studied Ethan more carefully now. The maintenance jacket suddenly felt less convincing. The posture. The stillness. The strange discipline in the way he carried himself under humiliation. It no longer looked like weakness. It looked deliberate. One of the investors leaned toward another and whispered, "Who is this guy?" Across the ballroom, a staff member hurried onto the stage and whispered urgently into Victoria's ear. Her expression hardened instantly. "The pianist still has not landed," the assistant murmured. "Air traffic grounded the flight in Chicago." Victoria closed her eyes briefly. Nearly 600 guests filled the hall tonight. Reporters. Donors. Executives. International partners. The concert could not collapse. Not here. Not tonight. She inhaled slowly, smoothing control back into her voice the way powerful people learn to do after years of never allowing panic to show. Then she turned toward Ethan again. "Tell me something honestly," she said coolly. "Can you actually play?" The ballroom fell quiet once more. Ethan looked toward the Steinway sitting alone beneath the stage lights. Black lacquer. Ivory keys. Silent and waiting like an old ghost. For a few seconds he said nothing at all. Then his eyes drifted toward Clara standing near the catering table clutching the silver tray against her chest. His daughter gave him the smallest nod. And somewhere deep inside the grand hall, beneath gold chandeliers and the weight of 1,000 judging eyes, something long buried inside Ethan Vale quietly began to wake up. The silence inside the grand ballroom deepened, not the kind of silence that comes from emptiness, but the kind that arrives when attention becomes so heavy it almost has weight. Ethan Vale still stood beside the Steinway, his fingers resting lightly above the keys without pressing them, as if the instrument itself was breathing and he was simply waiting for it to speak first. Victoria Laurent watched him with a controlled expression, but something inside her posture had shifted, a subtle hesitation that had not been there before. Professor Arthur Beaumont took another step forward, his voice now quieter but sharper with certainty. "If I am wrong," he said slowly, "then the world has changed more than I thought." Ethan finally spoke, his voice calm and steady, carrying no trace of performance. "This is not about the world," he said. "It is about memory. The words seemed to settle into the room like dust drifting through sunlight. Clara tightened her grip on the edge of the catering table, her eyes fixed on her father. She had never heard him speak like that before, not in that tone, not with that weight behind it. Victoria exhaled slowly, forcing herself back into control. "We do not have time for mystery," she said, gesturing toward the empty stage. "Our guest performer is delayed. The audience is waiting. The program must continue." A soft wave of agreement moved through the seated guests, but it lacked conviction. Everyone could feel it now, the fragile tension between expectation and uncertainty. Ethan slowly turned his gaze back toward the piano. For a moment, he did not move at all. Then he placed his hand gently on the edge of the seat and adjusted it by a few inches, as if aligning himself with something only he could see. Professor Beaumont whispered, almost to himself, "That adjustment. Only one pianist I ever knew sat like that." Victoria glanced at him sharply. "Enough," she said, but her voice had lost some of its authority. Ethan sat down. The movement was unhurried, deliberate, almost respectful, as if he were entering a space that had once belonged to him and still remembered him even if the world did not. The hall seemed to tighten around that single moment. Waiters stopped moving entirely. Conversations that had started again died mid-sentence. The air itself felt held in place. Clara stepped forward without realizing it, moving closer to the edge of the stage. Ethan placed both hands above the keys but did not yet play. He closed his eyes for a brief moment. In that silence, something invisible passed through him, not a transformation, but a return. A memory of another life where music was not decoration, but language. Victoria watched him carefully now, her skepticism no longer confident, but unsettled. She leaned slightly toward her assistant and whispered, "If this becomes a mistake, it will be remembered." The assistant did not respond. Professor Beaumont did not blink. Ethan's fingers finally lowered, and the first note emerged, soft and precise, like a single drop of water breaking the surface of a still lake. It was followed by another, and then another, each one deliberate, each one carrying the strange feeling of familiarity that no one in the room could immediately explain. Clara's breath caught. The sound did not feel like performance. It felt like something being remembered out loud. Victoria's expression began to change, not suddenly, but gradually, as if her certainty was being pulled apart one thread at a time by something she could not argue against. And in the center of the ballroom, beneath the golden light and the frozen attention of everyone present, Ethan Vale continued to play, and the world slowly began to forget how to move. The first notes continued to bloom inside the ballroom like light spreading across dark water, slow and irreversible, changing the shape of everything it touched. Ethan Vale's hands moved with a calm precision that did not feel learned in the present moment, but remembered from a life that had never truly left him. Each chord carried weight, not in volume, but in meaning, as if every sound was a sentence written long before and now finally spoken again. The audience did not move. Not a single glass lifted. Not a single whisper survived. Even the air conditioning vents seemed quieter, as if the building itself had decided to listen. Victoria Laurent stood motionless near the front row, her arms no longer folded. Her expression had softened without permission, like a defense she had not realized she depended on. Had begun to dissolve. Professor Arthur Beaumont had both hands pressed lightly against the edge of a table, his knuckles pale. "No," he whispered again, but this time it was not disbelief. It was recognition. Clara Vale stood at the edge of the stage now, just close enough to see her father clearly. Her eyes were wide, not with surprise, but with something deeper, something she had never been given language for. The man she knew as quiet, practical, always tired after long hours of work, was gone. In his place was something else entirely, something that made the silence in the room feel sacred. Ethan did not look at the crowd. He did not acknowledge Victoria. He did not acknowledge Professor Beaumont. His entire existence seemed anchored inside the piano, as if the instrument were not an object but a doorway. The melody shifted, becoming more complex, rising and falling like memory itself struggling to decide whether it should remain hidden or finally be free. A woman in the third row pressed a hand to her mouth. A man beside her lowered his head slightly, as if the sound had made him suddenly aware of something he had forgotten about his own life. Victoria took one step forward, then stopped. Her voice, when it came, was barely audible. "That piece," she said, almost to herself. "I have heard it before." Professor Beaumont turned his head slightly without looking away from Ethan. "You have not heard it," he replied softly. "You have only heard it performed by others." The distinction hung in the air like something fragile but undeniable. Ethan's hands shifted again, and the music deepened, growing warmer, more personal. It was no longer something being performed for an audience. It was something being lived in real time. Clara's throat tightened. She remembered small things she had never understood before. The way her father would pause when passing music stores. The way his fingers would tap silently on table surfaces when he thought no one was watching. The way he once cried without explanation while listening to rain against the roof late at night. She had never asked why. Now she did not need to. Victoria's composure continued to fracture in subtle ways. Her gaze drifted toward Ethan's face, searching for confirmation of something she was not ready to name. The billionaire who had commanded rooms like this for years, who had built an empire on certainty and control, now looked like someone standing at the edge of a truth she could no longer negotiate with. The final movement began slowly, almost hesitantly, like a door opening after years of being locked. The sound carried through the ballroom with a gentleness that made even the most powerful guests lower their heads. No one spoke. No one dared interrupt what was happening. Ethan's posture remained steady, but there was something in the set of his shoulders now that suggested not performance, but release. As the final notes approached, the room seemed to hold its breath together, as if even a single sound might break something delicate beyond repair. Clara stepped 1 inch closer to the stage, her eyes fixed on her father as if trying to memorize him in this form before he disappeared again into the world she knew. And then, just as softly as it had begun, the music reached its final note, hanging in the air without rushing to disappear, as if even silence needed a moment to understand what it had just witnessed. The final note still lingered in the air like a fading breath that no one in the room wanted to release, as if silence itself had become heavier than sound, and the entire ballroom of the Lauron Symphony Hall remained frozen in a state between disbelief and awe, where even the smallest movement would have felt like a violation of something sacred. Ethan Vale slowly lowered his hands from the piano keys, not in exhaustion, but in quiet completion, as though he had simply finished saying something he had carried for a very long time. No one applauded. No one spoke. The absence of reaction was not rejection, but reverence so deep it had no immediate form. Clara Vale stood near the edge of the stage, her eyes glistening with something she did not fully understand, watching her father as if seeing him for the first time in her life, not as the quiet man who fixed broken things, but as someone who had once spoken fluently in a language the world had forgotten. Victoria Lauron remained still, her posture unchanged, but her certainty had completely dissolved, replaced by a quiet confusion that made her appear less like a powerful chief executive officer and more like someone trying to reassemble a belief she had taken for granted her entire life. Professor Arthur Beaumont finally exhaled, a slow and fragile sound, then stepped forward another pace, his voice trembling slightly. That, he said, barely above a whisper, was not interpretation. That was identity. A soft murmur began to ripple through the audience, not of excitement, but of realization, as several guests exchanged uncertain glances, as if trying to confirm that what they had just witnessed was real and not shared imagination. Victoria turned her head slowly toward Ethan, her expression no longer sharp, but unsettled in a way that stripped away the distance she normally kept from others. "Who are you?" she asked, the question no longer carrying authority, but genuine uncertainty. Ethan did not answer immediately. Instead, he looked down at the piano keys, as if they still held echoes of a past conversation only he and the instrument could understand. Clara took one small step forward, her voice barely audible. "Daddy?" The single word seemed to break something open in him. Ethan closed his eyes for a brief moment, then opened them again, and when he spoke, his voice carried neither pride nor apology, only truth. "There was a time," he said slowly, "when I believed the world could only hear music if it was loud enough." Professor Beaumont shook his head gently, his eyes moist with recognition. "And now," he replied, "you remember that it never needed to be loud at all." The ballroom remained silent, but it was no longer empty silence. It was filled with understanding that had arrived too suddenly to be spoken. Victoria stepped back slightly, as if the weight of what she had just witnessed had physically shifted her balance. The label she had placed on Ethan Vale no longer made sense. Maintenance staff. Uneducated. Invisible. None of it could survive what had just happened in front of her. Ethan slowly rose from the piano bench. The movement was unhurried, almost ceremonial, as if he were leaving a place that had briefly allowed him to exist as his full self. Clara instinctively moved closer, and for the first time since the evening began, Ethan reached out and gently placed his hand on her shoulder. That simple gesture carried more truth than any explanation he could have offered. The audience remained frozen, waiting not for another performance, but for meaning to settle. And in that suspended moment, beneath the golden chandeliers of the Laurent Symphony Hall, it became clear that what had just been heard was not only music, but the return of someone who had been silent for far too long. The silence inside the Laurent Symphony Hall did not break immediately. It stretched, fragile and weightless, as if the entire room was afraid that even breathing too loudly might erase what had just happened. Ethan Vale still stood beside the piano bench, his hand resting lightly on his daughter Clara's shoulder, grounding himself in something real after stepping out of a world he had not visited in years. Slowly, movement began to return to the room in small, uncertain fragments. A guest lowered their glass. Another shifted in their seat as if remembering they had a body. Then, somewhere near the center row, a single pair of hands came together in a slow, hesitant clap. The sound was soft at first, almost apologetic, but it echoed through the hall like the beginning of a tide. Then another clap followed. And another. Until the entire ballroom was no longer silent, but filled with something far more powerful than applause. It was recognition. Victoria Laurent stood still as it unfolded, her hands no longer folded, her posture no longer controlled. The expression she wore was not the expression of a woman who had lost authority, but of someone who had discovered she had been standing on the wrong understanding of reality. She looked at Ethan again, and this time there was no judgment in her eyes. Only questions she did not yet know how to ask. Professor Arthur Beaumont stepped forward once more, now close enough to the stage that his voice carried clearly without effort. "I was present," he said quietly, addressing no one in particular and everyone at once, "the night you disappeared from the conservatory circuit. No announcement. No farewell. Just silence." Ethan's gaze lowered slightly, not in shame, but in acknowledgement of something long carried. Clara tightened her grip on his hand for a moment, sensing the weight in those words even if she did not yet understand their full meaning. Victoria finally spoke again, but her voice had changed completely. "You were that pianist," she said slowly, as if each word required permission to exist. Ethan did not correct her. He did not confirm it either. He simply said, "I was someone who made a choice." The room quieted again, not out of shock this time, but out of attention so complete it bordered on reverence. Clara looked up at her father, her voice fragile but clear. "Why did you stop playing?" The question did not echo. It landed softly, but it carried farther than anything else said that night. Ethan turned slightly toward her, his expression softening in a way that no audience had ever seen before. "Because," he said gently, "some sounds belong to moments that do not return." Victoria's gaze lowered, and for the first time in her life of boardrooms, negotiations, and controlled outcomes, she had no immediate response. The certainty she had built her identity on no longer felt reliable. Instead, something unfamiliar settled in its place. Respect without hierarchy. Understanding without condition. Professor Beaumont nodded slowly, as if accepting an answer he had waited years to hear, even if it was incomplete. Around them, the ballroom continued to exist, but it no longer felt like a stage for performance. It felt like a place where something private had briefly become visible to the world and then returned to silence. Ethan gently released Clara's hand and placed both hands at his sides. The piano behind him remained open, still warm from what had just been played, as if it remembered him more clearly than the people watching. Victoria took one small step forward, then stopped again, her voice quieter than before. "If you ever choose to play again," she said carefully, "this hall would listen differently now." Ethan looked at her for a long moment, not as a billionaire, not as a critic, but as someone who had finally stopped speaking over the sound of truth. "Listening," he replied softly, "is always where music begins." And for the first time since the evening had started, no one in the Laurent Symphony Hall misunderstood him. The applause inside the Laurent Symphony Hall gradually softened into something more restrained, not disappearing, but transforming into a steady current of respect that lingered in the air like the final resonance of a deep piano chord that refuses to fully fade. Ethan Vale remained still for a moment longer, his posture calm, as if allowing the room to settle back into itself after something irreversible had taken place. Clara stood close beside him, still holding his hand, her eyes occasionally drifting toward the piano as though she expected it to speak again at any second. Victoria Laurent remained near the front row, her presence no longer commanding the space in the way it had earlier. Instead, she looked almost contemplative, as if recalibrating every assumption she had made about the man standing only a few feet away. Professor Arthur Beaumont slowly adjusted his stance, his voice quieter now, but steady. "There are performances," he said carefully, "and then there are confessions disguised as music." Ethan did not respond immediately. His gaze remained on the piano bench, then shifted briefly toward Clara. The hall waited, uncertain whether the moment had truly ended or whether something else was still unfolding beneath the surface. Then, without warning, a voice called softly from the far side of the ballroom. It was a young woman seated among the donors, her expression uncertain but sincere. "Was that really Chopin as written?" she asked, "or was it something more personal?" The question did not carry skepticism. It carried curiosity mixed with reverence. Professor Beaumont answered before Ethan could. "It was both," he said. "That is why no one will forget it." Victoria finally turned fully toward Ethan, her tone no longer sharp, but carefully measured. "You could have continued," she said. "You could have built an entire career from that level of talent." Ethan exhaled slowly, his voice calm and grounded. "A career," he replied, "is not the same as a life." The word settled across the room with quiet weight. Clara looked up at him again, studying his face as if trying to connect the man she knew with the man the world had just discovered. "Did you stop because of me?" she asked softly. The question hung in the air longer than anything before it. Ethan immediately shook his head, his expression gentle but certain. "No," he said. "I stopped because I chose to stay." Victoria's gaze lowered slightly at that, as if the simplicity of the answer carried more complexity than anything she had expected. For the first time, she seemed less like a figure of corporate authority and more like someone standing at the edge of understanding a truth she had never been taught to recognize. Professor Beaumont stepped closer to Ethan, now speaking with quiet urgency. "The world would have given you everything," he said. Ethan looked at him, his expression calm but distant, as if recalling a different life. "The world," he replied, "does not always know what to do with silence." A soft hush moved through the audience again, deeper this time, more reflective than reactive. The guests were no longer waiting for entertainment. They were absorbing something they could not immediately define. Clara shifted slightly closer to her father, her voice small but steady. "I like when you play," she said. Ethan's expression softened, and for a brief moment, the weight he carried seemed lighter. "Then you are the only audience I ever needed," he said quietly. Victoria heard the words clearly. Something in her expression tightened briefly, not from discomfort, but from recognition of a kind of truth that did not rely on status or achievement. The piano remained open behind them, untouched now, yet still central to everything in the room. Ethan finally stepped slightly away from it, as if closing a conversation without ending it. And as the ballroom remained wrapped in a silence that no longer felt empty, it became clear that nothing about this evening would return to what it had been before. The atmosphere inside the Laurent Symphony Hall had changed again, but this time the change was not sudden or dramatic. It was slow, almost imperceptible, like a room gradually remembering how to breathe after holding its breath for too long. Guests remained seated, though few spoke. Some simply stared at the stage where Ethan Vale now stood beside the piano, no longer performing, no longer hidden behind motion, but fully present in a way that made silence feel intentional rather than empty. Clara stayed close to him, her hand still lightly touching his sleeve as if confirming he was real. Victoria Laurent had stepped slightly away from the front row, her posture no longer rigid, her expression now carrying something closer to contemplation than judgment. Professor Arthur Beaumont remained near the aisle, watching Ethan with an intensity that suggested memory and realization were still aligning inside his mind. Then, slowly, Professor Beaumont spoke again, this time not to the room, but directly to Ethan. "Do you know how many believed you would become the defining pianist of your generation?" he asked. The question did not demand an answer, but it carried the weight of history. Ethan looked at him calmly, his voice steady when he responded. "I know what people believed," he said. "But belief and responsibility do not always travel together." A faint murmur passed through the audience, not of disagreement, but of reflection. Victoria tilted her head slightly, studying him more carefully now. "You speak as if success was something you had to escape," she said. Ethan turned toward her briefly, not defensive, not distant, simply honest. "Success is often louder than life," he replied. Clara looked up at him again, her voice quiet but sincere. "Is that why you chose us?" The question softened the entire room. Ethan paused for a moment, then knelt slightly so he was closer to her eye level. "I did not choose less," he said gently. "I chose what mattered when nothing else could." Something in the hall shifted at that moment, subtle but undeniable. The guests were no longer observing a performance or a revelation. They were witnessing a life being understood in real time. Professor Beaumont lowered his head slightly, as if acknowledging a truth he had long suspected but never confirmed. Victoria took a slow breath, her expression now less certain, more human. "People will not understand that choice," she said. Ethan stood again, his gaze steady. "They do not need to understand it," he replied. "They only need to respect that it exists." A silence followed, not heavy, but clear, like glass that has been cleaned after years of dust. Clara shifted closer to him, leaning slightly into his side. The gesture was small, but it grounded him in a way the room could see but not fully interpret. Victoria watched this interaction carefully, her expression softening further as she began to recognize something unfamiliar in Ethan Vale. Not talent. Not reputation. But something more difficult to define. Stability without display. Strength without pursuit. The piano remained untouched behind them, yet its presence still dominated the stage, as if it were waiting not for another performance, but for acknowledgement that what had already occurred was complete. Professor Beaumont finally spoke once more, quieter than before. "The tragedy," he said, "is not that the world lost your music. It is that it never understood why it mattered in the first place." Ethan did not respond immediately. Instead, he placed one hand gently on the edge of the piano, almost as if saying goodbye to something that had once been both his identity and his burden. Then he spoke softly. "Music was never meant to be understood," he said. It was meant to be felt when words are not enough. The ballroom remained still, absorbing that final thought as if it were a final note that continued to resonate beyond sound. And in that shared stillness, something unspoken passed between everyone present, a quiet recognition that what they had witnessed was not an ending, but the return of something the world had forgotten how to hear. The silence inside the Laurent Symphony Hall no longer felt like something fragile. It had transformed into something complete, like a chapter that had reached its final line and refused to be rewritten. Ethan Vale stood quietly beside the piano, no longer as a performer, no longer as an invisible worker, but simply as a man whose truth had briefly become visible to an entire room. Clara remained close to him, her presence small but steady, her hand still lightly resting against his sleeve. Victoria Laurent stood a few steps away, her earlier certainty replaced entirely by a quieter, more reflective stillness. Professor Arthur Beaumont remained near the aisle, his expression softened by recognition and time. No one spoke immediately. It was as if the room collectively understood that anything said too quickly might diminish what had just occurred. Then Clara finally broke the silence. Her voice was gentle, but it carried clearly across the front of the hall. "Daddy, are we going home now?" The question was simple, but it shifted the atmosphere. Ethan turned toward her slowly, his expression softening in a way that only she seemed to fully understand. "Yes," he said quietly. "We are going home." Victoria heard those words and hesitated. Something about them felt final in a way she was not prepared for. Not an ending of music, but an ending of distance. She took a careful step forward, her voice no longer carrying authority, but sincerity. "Wait," she said. Ethan paused, looking at her calmly. Victoria struggled for a moment, as if searching for the correct version of herself to speak from. Finally, she said, "I owe you an apology." The room remained silent. Ethan did not interrupt. Victoria continued, her tone more measured now. "I judged you without understanding anything about you. I reduced you to something small because it was easier than seeing what was in front of me." Ethan listened without expression of pride or resentment. "Professor." Beaumont watched quietly, as if witnessing a moment he had long expected would eventually come. Victoria lowered her gaze slightly before continuing. "What you played tonight, it was not just talent. It was something I have spent my entire life around, but rarely seen like that." Ethan finally spoke, his voice calm and steady. "You do not need to understand it fully," he said. "Only to respect that it was real." Victoria nodded slowly, accepting the weight of that statement without resistance. Clara looked between them, sensing something shifting but not fully knowing what it meant. Professor Beaumont stepped forward one last time, his voice softer than before. "The world has a habit of recognizing greatness only after it has already been quiet for too long," he said. Ethan turned slightly toward him. "Quiet is not absence," he replied. "It is often where truth learns to exist without interruption." Those words settled into the room with a finality that did not feel like closure, but understanding. Victoria glanced once more at Ethan, then at Clara, and something in her expression softened further, no longer driven by ambition or control, but by reflection. "If you ever return to the stage," she said carefully, "this institution would consider it an honor." Ethan looked at the piano for a long moment before responding. "I do not know if I will return," he said. "But if I do, it will not be for recognition." Clara squeezed his hand gently, as if agreeing without needing words. Ethan placed one final glance toward the piano, then away from it. The choice he had made years ago remained unchanged, but now it was seen, and in being seen, it no longer carried isolation. As father and daughter turned to leave the stage, the audience did not rush to fill the silence. No one called out. No one demanded more. They simply watched as a man who had once been invisible walked away with the only person who had ever needed to hear him, and in that quiet departure, the hall understood that the most powerful performances are sometimes the ones that never ask to be remembered, yet never fade.